The restaurant was bustling with the sounds of clinking glasses, laughter, and the soft hum of background music. It was Grace's birthday, and I had gone all out to make it special. Friends and family surrounded us, celebrating with toasts and stories. I watched Grace from across the table, her smile radiant, her laughter infectious. For a moment, everything felt perfect. That is, until the server approached me. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with a nervous energy that seemed out of place for someone working at such an upscale venue. As he leaned in to place a dish in front of me, he slipped a folded piece of paper under my napkin. Our eyes met briefly, and I could see a flicker of urgency there. Curiosity piqued. I waited until he had moved on before unfolding the note. The words, hastily scrawled in messy handwriting, hit me like a punch to the gut. "Beware of Henry Leah. He has intentions towards your wife." My heart began to pound. I glanced up, scanning the room until my eyes landed on Grace. She was chatting animatedly with Henry Leah, a family friend we had known for years. His hand rested casually on the back of her chair, his body angled towards her in a way that suddenly seemed too intimate. I felt a surge of anger and confusion. "Jacob, are you all right?" My brother Tom's voice pulled me from my thoughts. He was seated next to me, a concerned expression on his face. "Yeah, just something came up," I muttered, folding the note and slipping it into my pocket. I couldn't deal with this right now, not here, not in front of everyone. I watched Grace and Henry closely throughout the evening. Twice, they disappeared together, each time for several minutes. Each time, I felt my suspicions grow. By the time they returned to the table for the second time, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. "Grace," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "can I talk to you for a moment?" She looked at me, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Of course, Jacob. What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "What's going on with you and Henry?" Her eyes widened, a hint of panic flashing across her face. "What do you mean? We're just talking, catching up." "Talking?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "Then why did you disappear together?" "Twice." Grace glanced at Henry, who was watching us with a smug expression. "It's not what you think, Jacob. We're just friends." "Friends?" I shook my head, feeling my anger rise. "A server gave me a note warning me about Henry's intentions towards you. What am I supposed to think?" Grace's face paled. "A note? Jacob, please, you have to believe me." I leaned in closer, lowering my voice. "Grace, I need you to be honest with me. Are you having an affair with Henry?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her silence spoke volumes. My heart sank as I realized that everything was about to change. The rest of the dinner felt like an eternity. The festive atmosphere seemed to mock the turmoil brewing inside me. Grace's forced smiles and occasional glances at Henry only fueled my suspicions. When dessert was finally served, I seized the opportunity to pull Grace aside. We slipped into a quiet corner of the restaurant away from the prying eyes of our guests. "Grace," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need to know the truth. What is going on between you and Henry?" She looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting nervously. "Jacob, please, this isn't the time or place." "It's exactly the time and place," I insisted. "I need to understand what's happening here. You owe me that much." Grace took a deep breath, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of guilt and fear. "Jacob, it's complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated, frustration boiling over. "Then uncomplicate it for me." She hesitated, then finally spoke. "Henry and we've been spending time together. At first, it was just friendly. We would talk about work, life, things we couldn't always share with others. But then it started to become something more." "More?" I echoed, my heart pounding. "How much more, Grace?" Grace closed her eyes as if bracing herself for the impact of her own words. "I started feeling something for him, Jacob, something I haven't felt in a long time. An attraction, a connection." I stared at her, struggling to process her confession. "And what about us, Grace? What about our connection?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I love you, Jacob, I really do. But with Henry, it's different. It's exciting in a way that I haven't felt in years." "Exciting?" I felt a surge of anger. "So you're willing to throw everything away for a thrill?" "It's not just a thrill," she protested. It's something deeper. I need to explore it to understand what it means. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling utterly lost. And where does that leave me? Us? Grace looked away, tears streaming down her cheeks. I don't know, Jacob. I wish I had the answers. I took a deep breath, trying to rein in my emotions. You owe it to me, to us, to figure this out without destroying everything we've built. I know, she whispered. But I can't ignore what I'm feeling. I need to see where this goes, even if it means risking everything. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating me. Grace, you're asking me to stand by while you explore a relationship with another man. How can you expect me to do that? I'm not asking you to accept it, she said quietly. I'm just asking you to understand. I shook my head, feeling the sting of betrayal. I don't know if I can, Grace. I don't know if I want to. We stood there in silence, the distance between us growing with each passing second. The truth was out, but it offered no comfort, no closure. Only more questions and the painful realization that our lives would never be the same. The drive home was a tense, silent ordeal. Grace and I sat in the car, the distance between us more than just physical. The tension was palpable, each passing minute stretching it tighter. My mind raced with the weight of her confession, trying to make sense of the feelings that seemed to tear us apart. As we pulled into the driveway, I turned off the engine and took a deep breath. We need to talk, Grace, now. She nodded, her face pale. I know. We walked into the house and went straight to the living room. I closed the door behind us, wanting to ensure we wouldn't be disturbed. I turned to face her, my emotions a turbulent storm. Grace, how long has this been going on? She hesitated, wringing her hands. A few months. We started talking more at social events, then it became more frequent. It escalated recently. I felt a surge of anger. Months? You've been lying to me for months? Grace flinched. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did. I didn't know how to tell you. I shook my head, feeling the sting of betrayal. So, what now? You want to explore your connection with Henry? Where does that leave us? She looked down, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know, Jacob. I'm so confused. I love you, but I also feel something for Henry that I can't ignore. You love me, I repeated, incredulous. How can you say that when you're considering being with someone else? Grace's voice trembled. It's not that simple. I do love you, but I need to understand these feelings. I need to see where this goes. At the expense of our marriage, I demanded, my voice rising. How can you be so selfish? Selfish? She snapped, her own anger flaring. You think this is easy for me? Do you think I want to hurt you? Then why do it? I countered. Why risk everything for a fling? It's not a fling, she shot back. It's something I can't explain, something I need to figure out. I stared at her, my heart breaking. And what am I supposed to do? Just stand by and watch you be with another man? I don't know, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I wish I had the answers. The silence between us was deafening, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Grace, if you go through with this, I don't know if I can stay. I can't live with the thought of you being with someone else. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. Please, Jacob, try to understand. I need to do this for me. I don't want to lose you, but I can't ignore what I'm feeling. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. You need to make a choice, Grace. Him or me. You can't have both. She closed her eyes, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I know, Jacob. I don't know what to do. We stood there, the chasm between us growing wider. The truth was out, but it offered no solace, no solution. Only more pain and uncertainty. I turned away, feeling the weight of her betrayal crush me. As I walked to the kitchen to get some water, the doorbell rang. I froze, my heart pounding. Grace looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. Who could that be? I walked to the door and opened it to find Henry standing there, a smug look on his face. Good evening, Jacob. May I come in? My blood boiled at the sight of him. What the hell are you doing here, Henry? He glanced past me to Grace, who stood frozen in the hallway. I think we all need to have a conversation. I stepped forward, blocking his view of Grace. There's nothing to discuss. Leave. Henry smirked, unfazed. I'm not going anywhere, Jacob. Grace and I have things to sort out. Before I could respond, Grace's voice broke the tension. Henry, please, not here. not now. He looked at her, his expression softening slightly. Grace, we need to talk about this. I felt a surge of protective anger. She said, not here, get out. Henry's eyes hardened. Make me. The tension in the air was thick, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. You really want to do this, Henry? Here and now. Grace stepped between us, her hands raised. Stop it, both of you. This isn't helping. I glared at Henry, my fists clenched. You need to leave, Henry, now. He met my gaze, unyielding. This isn't over, Jacob. As he turned to leave, I watched him go, a sense of impending doom settling over me. I turned to Grace, who looked more fragile than ever. This is tearing us apart, Grace. You need to decide what you want. She nodded, her face streaked with tears. I know, Jacob, I know. The door closed behind Henry, but the conflict was far from over. The battle for our marriage had just begun, and I feared the worst was yet to come. The next few days were a blur of awkward silences and tense exchanges. Grace and I existed under the same roof, but the emotional distance between us seemed insurmountable. Each night I lay awake, haunted by the image of her with Henry, the man who had somehow managed to drive a wedge between us. I decided I couldn't just sit back and let things unfold. I needed to confront this head-on. Grace's birthday party had left too many questions unanswered, too much tension unresolved. One evening, after another silent dinner, I saw my chance. Grace announced she needed to go out to clear her head, her voice heavy with the strain of our recent arguments. I watched her leave, then grabbed my keys and followed her, determined to confront Henry once and for all. As I tailed her car through the city, I felt a mix of anger and resolve. This had to end. I needed to hear from Henry himself what his intentions were and to tell him to stay away from my wife. She stopped at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. I parked a few spots away and watched as she met Henry at the entrance. They greeted each other with familiarity that made my blood boil. I waited for a few moments before stepping out of the car. I approached the cafe, my heart pounding. As I reached the door, I saw them through the window, sitting at a corner table, deep in conversation. Henry reached across the table, taking Grace's hand in his. That was my breaking point. I walked in, the bell above the door jangling loudly. Their heads turned towards me, and Grace's eyes widened in shock. Jacob, what are you doing here? She asked, her voice trembling. I'm here to talk to Henry, I said, my gaze fixed on him. We need to settle this. Henry leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing on his lips. What's there to settle, Jacob? I took a step closer, my hands clenched into fists. You know exactly what, Henry. You need to back off and leave my wife alone. Henry stood up, his expression hardening. Grace is capable of making her own decisions, Jacob. This isn't about you. I felt a surge of anger. This is very much about me. You're interfering in our marriage, and it needs to stop. Grace stood up, placing herself between us. Please, both of you, this isn't the place for this. Henry looked past her, his eyes meeting mine with a challenging glint. Maybe we should take this outside, Jacob. Fine by me, I replied, turning towards the door. As we stepped outside, Henry's associates appeared, flanking him. They were large, intimidating men, clearly there to back him up. Henry had come prepared, and it was clear he wasn't planning to back down easily. Jacob, don't do this, Grace pleaded, following us outside. Stay out of this, Grace, I said, my voice firm. This is between me and him. Henry smirked, crossing his arms. You really want to do this, Jacob? You think you can take all of us on? I squared my shoulders, my determination unwavering. I don't care how many of you there are. I'm not backing down. Henry's associates stepped forward, blocking my path. Last chance to walk away, Jacob, one of them warned. Get out of my way, I growled, my anger rising. They moved closer, their size and number imposing, but I didn't back down. Years of dealing with difficult, arrogant executives had taught me how to stand my ground. I wasn't going to let Henry intimidate me. Just as things were about to escalate, Grace stepped between us again, her voice desperate. Stop it. This isn't solving anything. I ignored her, my focus on Henry. This ends now. Stay away from Grace or you'll regret it. Henry's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard glare. You don't scare me, Jacob. Before I could respond, one of Henry's associates lunged at me. I sidestepped him, but another grabbed my arm, twisting it painfully. I managed to break free, shoving him back. The scuffle drew the attention of passers-by who began to gather, murmuring and pointing. Grace screamed for us to stop, but the chaos continued. Suddenly, a voice rang out above the noise. Enough. We all turned to see an off-duty officer approaching, his badge glinting in the streetlights. Break it up now. Henry's associates hesitated, glancing at each other. The officer stepped between us, his presence imposing. What's going on here? He's trying to steal my wife, I said, my voice filled with frustration and anger. The officer looked at Henry, then at Grace, who was crying and shaking her head. All of you go home, he commanded. This isn't the place for this. Henry's associates backed off, and Henry gave me one last glare before turning away. Grace ran to me, her tears flowing freely. Jacob, please, let's just go home. I nodded, my anger slowly ebbing away, replaced by exhaustion. All right, let's go. As we walked back to the car, I knew this confrontation was far from over. But for now, the blockade had been broken, and I had made my stand. We drove home in silence, the weight of the evening hanging heavily over us. The fight for our marriage was just beginning, and I knew the hardest battles were yet to come. The drive home from the cafe was suffused with a heavy, oppressive silence. The confrontation had left us both emotionally drained. Grace sat beside me, her face turned towards the window, tears streaking down her cheeks. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. As soon as we got home, Grace headed to the living room, and I followed her. She sank into the couch, burying her face in her hands. I stood there, watching her, feeling a mix of anger, hurt, and confusion. The woman I loved, the woman I had trusted, was now a stranger to me. Grace, I began, my voice strained. We need to talk. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. Jacob, I'm so sorry. Sorry? I snapped, the words sounding hollow. Sorry doesn't cut it, Grace. You need to explain to me why you did this. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It started with harmless conversations, but then it grew into something more. And you never thought to tell me? I asked, my voice rising. You never thought I deserved to know what was going on. I was scared, she admitted, tears welling up again. I was afraid of losing you. You were afraid of losing me, I repeated, incredulous. Grace, you already lost me the moment you decided to pursue Henry. She sobbed, her body shaking. I know, Jacob. I was stupid. I got caught up in something I didn't understand. I felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. And what about us? I demanded. What about our life, our marriage? Did that mean nothing to you? Of course it meant something, she cried. I love you, Jacob. I always have, but I felt like I was suffocating. I needed to feel something different, something new. I ran a hand through my hair, pacing the room. So what now? You want to keep seeing him? You want to throw away everything we've built for some fling? It's not that simple, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't want to lose you, but I can't ignore what I felt with Henry. I stopped pacing and turned to face her. Grace, you have to choose. You can't have both. You need to decide what's more important, our marriage or your affair. She looked at me, her eyes filled with anguish. Jacob, I don't know what to do. I'm so confused. Confused? I echoed, my voice bitter. There's nothing confusing about it, Grace. You made vows to me to love and cherish me, and you broke them. She stood up, facing me with a desperate expression. I know I did, and I regret it more than you can imagine, but I need you to understand why I did it. Understand, I shouted, unable to contain my anger any longer. How am I supposed to understand that the woman I love, the woman I trusted, would betray me like this? Grace flinched at my words, fresh tears streaming down her face. Jacob, please. I need you to see that I never stopped loving you. This wasn't about us, it was about me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Grace, you need to figure out what you want. And you need to do it quickly, because I can't keep living like this. She nodded, wiping her tears. I understand. I need time to think, to sort through my feelings. I looked at her, feeling a mix of sadness and resignation. Take the time you need, Grace. but know that my patience isn't infinite." We stood there in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. I turned and walked towards the bedroom, needing space to clear my head. As I lay down, staring at the ceiling, the turmoil inside me swirled. The woman I loved had shattered my trust, and I didn't know if it could ever be mended. The following days were a blur of emotional highs and lows. Grace and I barely spoke, each lost in our own thoughts. One evening, I found her sitting on the porch, looking out at the sunset. I joined her, the silence between us heavy. "Jacob," she began softly, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I realize now that I let myself get swept away by something that wasn't real," she said, her voice trembling. "What I have with you is real. Our life, our love, it's real. And I don't want to lose that." I looked at her, my heart aching. "Grace, do you really mean that? Are you willing to let go of Henry and work on our marriage?" She nodded, tears in her eyes. "Yes, Jacob. I choose you. I choose us. I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." I felt a glimmer of hope, mixed with a lingering sense of doubt. "Grace, it's going to take time for me to trust you again, but I'm willing to try if you are." She reached out and took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "I am, Jacob. I promise you I am." As we sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time I believed we might be able to navigate it together. The days following our conversation on the porch were tense but hopeful. Grace and I worked to rebuild our trust, slowly piecing together the fragments of our broken relationship. Yet an underlying tension remained, like a storm cloud on the horizon. One evening as we sat in the living room, the doorbell rang. Grace and I exchanged a wary glance. Neither of us was expecting visitors. I got up to answer it, my heart pounding. Standing on the porch was Henry, his face twisted in anger and desperation. He pushed past me before I could react, storming into the house. "Henry, what the hell are you doing here?" I demanded, following him. Grace stood up from the couch, her face pale. "Henry, you need to leave. Now." "I'm not going anywhere," Henry spat, his eyes wild. "I can't believe you chose him over me, Grace, after everything we shared." Grace took a step back, her voice trembling. "Henry, it was a mistake. I love Jacob. Please, just go." Henry's eyes flicked to me, his expression darkening. "You think you can just walk away from me? You think you can just forget everything?" I moved to stand between Henry and Grace, my fists clenched. "She told you to leave, Henry. This is over." Henry's face contorted with rage. "Over? It's not over until I say it's over." Before I could react, Henry lunged at me, a knife glinting in his hand. I barely had time to register the danger before he was upon me. The world seemed to slow down as I grappled with him, the blade dangerously close. "Jacob!" Grace screamed, her voice filled with terror. I struggled to keep the knife away, but Henry was stronger than I had anticipated. We crashed into the coffee table, the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood filling the room. Just then, the door burst open again, and the off-duty officer from the previous confrontation appeared, his gun drawn. "Freeze! Drop the weapon," he commanded. Henry didn't listen. His focus was entirely on me, his eyes filled with murderous intent. The officer didn't hesitate. A shot rang out, the deafening sound echoing through the house. Henry stumbled back, clutching his side, the knife clattering to the floor. Grace ran to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Jacob, are you okay?" I nodded, breathing heavily. "I'm fine. Are you okay?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, but oh my God, Henry." The officer approached, heaping his gun trained on Henry, who was now lying on the floor, bleeding and gasping for breath. "Stay down. Help is on the way," the officer said, his voice calm and authoritative. Henry looked up at me, his expression a mixture of pain and regret. You ruined everything," he wheezed. "No, Henry," I said, my voice steady. "You did that all on your own." The paramedics arrived shortly after, quickly attending to Henry. Grace and I stood to the side, holding each other, the reality of the situation sinking in. The officer spoke with the paramedics, then turned to us. "Are you both okay?" he asked. "We're fine," I replied, my arm around Grace. "Thank you for your help." The officer nodded, Just doing my job, but you two should probably give a statement at the station." We agreed, and after the paramedics took Henry away, we followed the officer to the police station. The drive was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. At the station, we gave our statements, recounting the events of the evening. The officer assured us that we had acted in self-defense and that Henry would be charged with assault. As we left the station, Grace clung to my arm, her body shaking. "Jacob, I was so scared. I thought I was going to lose you." I held her close, my own fear and relief mingling. "It's over now, Grace. We're safe." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I know. And I promise you, I will never let anything come between us again." We drove home in silence, the weight of the night's events heavy on our shoulders. As we pulled into the driveway, I turned to Grace. "We have a lot to work through, but we'll get through this. Together." She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. Together. We walked into the house, the shattered remnants of our living room a stark reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. But as we stood there, holding each other, I felt a renewed sense of hope. We had faced the storm and come out the other side, battered but still standing. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time I felt confident that we could navigate it. Together we would rebuild what had been broken and emerge stronger than before. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the remnants of our shattered living room. Grace and I had spent the night on the couch, wrapped in each other's arms, too exhausted to move. The events of the previous night still hung heavily in the air, but there was a sense of calm as well, a feeling that we had survived the worst. I gently disentangled myself from Grace and headed to the kitchen to make coffee. The familiar routine was comforting, a reminder that life would go on, even after such chaos. As I poured the steaming liquid into 2 mugs, Grace appeared in the doorway, looking tired but resolute. "Morning," I said softly, handing her a mug. "Morning," she replied, taking a sip. "Thank you." We sat at the kitchen table in silence for a few moments, each lost in our thoughts. Finally, Grace spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "Jacob, I need to say something." I looked at her, bracing myself for whatever was coming. "Go ahead." "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, her eyes fixed on her mug. "About us, about what happened. I realize now how much I hurt you and how close I came to losing everything that matters to me." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I let myself get swept up in something that wasn't real," she said, her voice steadying. "I thought I needed excitement, something new. But the truth is, what I needed was to face the problems in our marriage instead of running away from them." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Grace, I appreciate you saying that. I know it wasn't easy, but we both have things to work on." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with determination. "I want to work on us, Jacob. I want to rebuild what we had, but stronger this time. I don't want to live with regrets." I squeezed her hand. "Neither do I, but we need to be honest with each other. No more secrets." "No more secrets," she agreed, tears welling up in her eyes. "I promise you, Jacob, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." We spent the rest of the morning talking, laying everything out on the table. We discussed our fears, our disappointments, and our hopes for the future. It was painful, but it was also cathartic. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we were truly communicating. In the following weeks, Grace and I sought counseling, both individually and as a couple. It was a difficult process, confronting the issues that have led us to this point, but it was necessary. Through therapy, we began to understand each other better and learned healthier ways to address our problems. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Grace and I took a walk through our neighborhood. The air was cool and crisp, the sky painted with the colors of the setting sun. We walked in comfortable silence, the tension between us slowly dissolving. "Jacob," Grace said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Yes?" She stopped and turned to face me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. "I need to tell you something. When everything happened with Henry, I felt lost. But I also realized something important. I realized how much I love you, and how much I want to fight for our marriage." I looked at her, feeling a rush of emotion. "Grace, I love you too, and I'm willing to fight for us as well." She smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "Thank you, Jacob, for not giving up on me, on us." We continued our walk hand in hand, the past slowly fading behind us as we looked towards the future. It wasn't going to be easy and there would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time I felt confident that we could face them together. Months passed and our relationship began to heal. We learned to trust each other again, building a new foundation based on honesty and mutual respect. We found joy in the little things, like cooking dinner together or spending lazy Sunday mornings in bed. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Grace turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Jacob, do you ever think about what might have happened if things had gone differently?" I looked at her, considering the question. "Sometimes, but I try not to dwell on it. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it." She nodded, leaning her head on my shoulder. "I'm grateful for that, for us." "Me too," I replied, wrapping my arm around her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm golden light, I felt a sense of peace. We had faced our darkest moments and emerged stronger for it. Our journey wasn't over, but we were walking it together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came our way. Grace looked up at me, her eyes shining with love. "I love you, Jacob." "I love you too, Grace," I said, kissing her gently. In that moment, I knew that we would be okay. The road to reconciliation was long and difficult, but we were committed to traveling it together, and that made all the difference.